Okay, folks, all of those of you with stamina, there's about 20 minutes left. Questions? Question over there. Please make them questions, no long preamble. There is no time for preambles, okay? Question.
Hi. I'd like to ask Ali about the process that a country could take towards the BDS movement when it's that BDS movement is barely present in that country, not just Australia, any country. UK has a good amount of activists involved in that, but I'm from India and it is practically non-existent there. And for a country with that scope, how would it be helpful to start this movement there?
Is that working? That's on. Well, you start somewhere, and in fact, in India, there already is a campaign. There's an organization called INCABI, the Indian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. So if you're not aware of them, get in touch with them if you want to do work in India and learn how you can strengthen their efforts. So, you know, the good thing about countries where there isn't much BDS activism is they're all potential.
The former Israeli ambassador to the US made a very chilling statement in June 2014, I think it was, after ISIS had killed 1,600 Iraqi cadets, that he supported, well, the Sunnis were the lesser evil. And he said, just do the math, Assad's killed 200,000 people. To me, after being here all day, I think it's critical that the question of Palestine is related to the question of Syria, because Israel has control over that narrative. And what he said is being repeated by people in the mainstream, and they're not checking the math. So does Sydney Uni, does your conflict centre aim at any point? I know Tim Anderson does a lot of research into Syria, very well sourced work. Does your centre aim to combine those two subjects?
We have done some work on it, but my own feeling is that right here, right now in Australia, we cannot afford to appear to make support for the rights and freedoms of the Palestinians conditional on support for the Assad regime. We have to be very careful about that.
I just want to add that, just for your information, that a few weeks ago, the Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon at a conference made a very similar statement where he said, if I have to choose between Assad and between Iran and Hezbollah in Syria or ISIS, I prefer ISIS. You know, I think if just about any other quote-unquote Western leader expressed a preference for ISIS, you would have heard about it more loudly. Go for it.
Okay. Just on the BDS law in France, it actually, the good news with that, and I'm hoping that can be applied somewhere else, is that it has been quite well documented, and it has been shown in a lot of publication, which means that the people reaction to that is now, instead of having people boycotting or just a product from the settlement, you have a big majority of people who are totally uninterested in the boycotting everything Israeli. Do you think there's hope that that can happen in Australia, for example, that people will have such a reaction that at the idea that you can stop them from buying or from having free speech, that it fires back against the legislator or, at the end, the Israeli government?
Well, you know, it's true that the backlash against BDS is great publicity for BDS. You know, it creates public discourse about BDS, and that provides an opportunity for us to explain it. We definitely don't get equal time in the media, but you couldn't pay Hillary. I mean, if you wanted to pay Hillary Clinton to make a speech about BDS and you were Goldman Sachs, you'd have to pay her $250,000 at least, and she's giving speeches about BDS for free. So the fact that there's discourse about it and controversy, and it tags Israel as a problem, is good. Israel wants to escape the brand of being a problem. And any discussion about BDS traps Israel in this problematic category. So that's an asset for us. As far as France is concerned, I have to say that the crackdown is still going on, and it's very fierce. There was a decision by the Court of Cassation in October in a case of 12 activists who were convicted for holding a protest at a Carrefour supermarket. And that decision is being interpreted by the authorities that all BDS activism is illegal. So it's a very dangerous situation in France. And within the context of the state of emergency, where I wrote about this today, I wrote an article this morning for the Electronic Intifada about a Palestinian refugee in France, a man from Gaza who has official refugee status, and they're trying to take it away from him. And this is in the context of the state of emergency where, thousands of people are being accused, of being Salafists or other labels. So it's a very, very grave situation in France. There's an Amnesty International report on the dramatically deteriorating human rights situation in France. No one is paying attention to this. France is still marketing itself as the land of free speech, and je suis Charlie.
Thank you. Look, just on this issue of an Israeli senior person endorsing ISIS, I don't know how much we can read into that. I think it's a measure of their cynicism, because their priority is to smash the Syrian state, as they've had a decades-long policy of wanting to fragment the Middle East, and that was one of the major reasons the Israelis supported so strongly the Iraq War. So I think they are sticking to their agenda when they say we prefer ISIS, or ISIS is a smaller threat, because they want ISIS to finish the job in Syria first. Sorry, look, that was just a comment, but I'm happy for you to agree or disagree.
Any comment on the comment?
I think the fact that the Israeli government hasn't been widely criticised by Western governments for that statement, I think that speaks to the double standard. As he was saying, if another government had said they would, rather ISIS over, well, these days pretty much anyone, there would be wide criticism, right? But the fact that there wasn't, I think that really speaks to this double standard that, we have to be very careful about criticising the Israeli government for a whole range of reasons. So I think the fact that it's about ISIS, or that I think the Israeli government and their tactical framing, we can't assume that what they say is what they actually believe, yeah? There's a lot of tactical development, and Sarah was talking about this morning, like developing frames that they think people will buy into, and there will be emotional buttons and they will accept, right? And that statement about ISIS, maybe that was the fact that ISIS is such an emotional buzzword now that he knew that if he'd say it, it would get in the news, or that it would draw people's attention, or it would get the message across, right? Rather than actually genuinely saying that he supports ISIS. I think, and then just comes back to the previous question about how we can build BDS in Australia and stuff as well. I think it relates to this. I think everyone knows here that I think Israel-Palestine is a very complicated situation. So, how do we express the reality? We can't have, hours and hours and hours, of lectures and that sort of thing. The way that we do it is we show how it relates to what people care about, how it relates to their values. Now, of course, the Israeli government and its supporters have done that fairly well, fairly masterfully in their framing and how they will link, what Israel is doing and Israel's image to positive Western values, the only democracy in the Middle East. We saw this massively deployed by the Israeli lobby in the run-up to the New South Wales state election, where they had this very heavy framing of the idea that politicians should spend equal time in Israel and Palestine, the idea that it was bullying and censorship. So they're trying to create a metaphor, try to create a frame. Yeah? The difference with the Israeli government is that they create metaphors where there's actually no evidential link. where there's no evidential link, right? There's no evidence to say that requiring someone to spend equal time in Israel-Palestine is censorship or it's bullying at all. So I think that we can deploy the same sort of, we can deploy a framing, a value-conscious approach, but the different way that we do it is that there is actually an evidential real link. For example, you know, when we're talking about BDS, I think a lot of reasonably lucky people in Australia, it's a bit like trying to explain to, you know, to reasonably lucky people in Australia the benefit of human rights is like trying to explain to a fish the benefit of water, you know. But what sort of value that people can understand? Equality before the law and peace. So I think we can relate it to people's values there, but we need to make sure there's an evidential link there.
Hi. Clearly our government is very biased to the state of Israel and obviously very in line with US policy. And I'm just wanting to know, sorry, I've kind of lost my train of thought. Just with obviously our media also being really not fair in reporting the Palestinian side of the situation and very pro-Israel in terms of getting the story across. Do you actually see our media getting better or worse in terms of being a balanced forum in Australia?
I think, yeah. I mean, we have to be careful to disaggregate, okay? Because you know, briefly, I mean, I listened earlier to Michael Brull's presentation about the propaganda model, the Herman and Chomsky propaganda model, and it's very clear the salience of that model in explaining and predicting a lot of the responses by Australian media on the Israel-Palestine story. And you know, the evidence he'd assembled was very important, and I hope that paper will be widely publicised. However, I don't think that's all there is to it. The one of the 5 filters that Michael didn't mention was sources, and that's where your question comes in. Australia is in a strange position because, you know, Australians do have passports, Australians do travel, Australians are well aware that the dominant perspectives in Australia on a range of issues are at odds with what is held by informed opinion in much of the rest of the world. And one could list them. I mean, Australia seems to be, in its official diplomacy or in its mainstream political positioning, right out on the extreme right-wing fringe of world political opinion on so many issues. One could list them. You know, heedlessness over climate change, excuse-making for the Rajapaksa regime, relations with Indigenous people, responses to asylum seekers, the shrinking archipelago of civil liberties, etc., etc. And this, in many cases, there's a yawning chasm between that and Australian public opinion. You know, it's not like the United States. In the United States, unless I'm mistaken, a minority of people have passports. Nearly everyone in Australia has a passport. It's a kind of point of honour for Australians to go travelling abroad. So there is a curiosity, and the media struggle with that because mainstream media regard official sources as the prime sources of news. So what are they to do? Well, a lot of the more resourceful journalists within Australian media do find or create scope to exert their own agency. They do try to transcend the limitations implied by some of the filters in the propaganda model. And this is, I think, what explains this otherwise strange phenomenon that the journalists who have generally been most effective in holding the University of Sydney to account, for example, for the kind of twists and turns of its official statements, have been from the Australian. At the same time, the situation that earlier speakers outlined has given rise to a kind of flowering of independent media such as New Matilda, which have also done a very good job of cracking open some of the kind of strategic silences in Australian public life. And I think those kinds of initiatives will continue to prosper in the gap that exists between the two kind of sides of Australian political discourse. And new media launches, such as Guardian Australia, have come in and tried to occupy the same space. So there is a kind of adaptive capacity in the system. It's only as strong as we want to make it, and we all have our own media consumption habits to deploy and hopefully to aggregate and to spread via social media, and that's all part of the picture.
I was dismayed that David Cameron's government managed to blackball the local councils, and also very surprised that they could do this, that they had Westminster has the power to do this. And I don't think, I'd be very surprised if this did not go unchallenged. But not being an expert in constitutional law in Australia, I would be, again, it's very surprised if the Australian government had the power to punish councils for endorsing BDS.
Can I say something on that? That's actually a very interesting question, because the UK was actually, a minister went to Jerusalem and announced that the Cameron government would be issuing a new advice, or what's called a public policy note, to local councils, or public procurement note, to local councils about procurement policy, reminding them of their obligations, that they can't discriminate against any member of the World Trade Organization, or something like that, which is designed to act as a protection for Israel, and to somehow place boycott or divestment from Israel or from firms violating human rights out of bounds. However, the experts have looked at this and found that this note really creates no new legal obligations on councils. So in other words, by one interpretation, it was a propaganda exercise by the Cameron government to bully and intimidate local councils and local politicians into believing that they no longer have the right to condition their procurement policy on compliance with human rights. But experts have looked at this, said, they actually still have this right. The question is, what will the government do? Would it then start launching civil suits against councils that do this? Well, and if they do, that's also going to generate new resistance, because not only is it a further attack on Palestinian rights and a further act of complicity with Israel, but it's an attack on local democracy. And then, people who might not be too bothered about Palestine or Israel might say, well, wait a minute, why is this government in London, which claims to be all about localism and supporting local democracy, preventing a democratically elected local council from taking a stand? And remember that, the way the apartheid South Africa movement developed, it was always from the grassroots first. Local councils and town councils and local trade union branches and local, churches were passing resolutions on boycott and divestment, or were taking action on boycott and divestment first. And then it moved up, higher and higher, or to national organizations. And national governments were always the last. So, that's why they're sort of aiming at the grassroots. But that's also where there is the most resistance. Let's not forget that.
Okay. I'm going to take two more questions, one at the back and one from a young radical at the front. Yeah, you're the young radical at front. Didn't you know that? Look,
so the question is, whilst we are not officially in elections, it seems like we kind of are. So the question that I have, especially after the last two responses, what practical measures would the panel expect from people in this room to do with, their local politicians to ensure that we bridge the gap between the public opinion around BDS and what the politicians' view is?
I think right off the bat, just go and visit your politician. Set up meetings with them, email them, call them, tell them you want to meet with them, tell them what's important to you. Bob Carr's been very insistent on this, that this is very important. And as Bob Carr says, 95% of it, in influencing politicians when you meet with them, 95% is just turning up. So don't worry about having all the massive facts and data and everything. Get a group together, go and see a local politician.
yes, so, from my point of view, I'm trying to understand the social psychology of all the politicians of whatever persuasion, that they have this automatic, almost behaviorist rat in a Skinner box response to supporting Israel. So I've actually started to go along, and ask them about, have conversations with them about and write it up. I've only done half a dozen so far, and only one of them was a Tory. But I think that's what we have to do, to say, to express your sort of disbelief about their collusion with cruelty, because that's what it's about. We need to use that word. I mean, I used to be a professor of public policy, and in 10 years of textbooks, the word cruelty doesn't appear in any index. And yet that's the motivating force behind so many policies, whether it's the treatment of the Palestinians or Australia's treatment of asylum seekers. It's about cruelty. So, and I think you can use that word in conversations with local politicians, with local councillors, and with federal politicians, I'm sure. And APAN will go along with you.
Can I say one thing on this? In addition to showing up, which really is a large part of success, because, often politicians will say, I don't hear from anyone. We can be very unhappy with their positions, but, my theory, maybe Paul can test this in the laboratory, the Peace Laboratory where he works, is that, a country like Australia, which is small in terms of population compared with the United States, is still much more open than the United States. Your politicians are much more accessible. You can go and see your MP, it's fairly easy. And so, you have the opportunity to move them much more easily than we do in the United States. But a victory is a victory. If the policy of Australia changes or the policy of New Zealand changes, it makes headlines. The example I've been using is that last year, the City Council of Reykjavik, the capital of a country with 300,000 people, voted to boycott Israeli goods, and it made world headlines. So, Australia has significantly more weight in the world than Reykjavik. So the other thing is, it's important to ask them for something. From our experience, you go and see politicians and they say, well, what would you like me to do? And so, APAN has been mentioned. APAN is an organization which you can talk to and figure out what are some demands that you can make of your politicians. I'll give you an example. The US Congress is very difficult ground, as you know, for supporters of Palestinian rights. But there's been a campaign called No Way to Treat a Child, which has focused just on the fact that Israel is the only country in the world that subjects children to military tribunals and all that goes along with that: brutal treatment, torture, solitary confinement, and of course only Palestinian children. And so, part of this campaign was going to meet members of Congress, and they said, well, what do you want us to do? And they said, well, we want you to write a public letter to the executive branch to say that this must end and the US must, use its aid as leverage. And 19 members of Congress, it might not sound like much, but 19 members of Congress to take a strong position regarding Israel's human rights abuses is quite a significant achievement. So that's a first step. You've got them on record. It's something you can use. It's something you can show to other people and build support. You can use it in campaigns in local councils or in states and so on. So, but that was a very specific request. You're not saying, overnight impose sanctions on Israel or, whatever. I'm not saying don't be ambitious in your demands, but be, of course we want to get there, but go with manageable demands that are still strong in terms of the positions you're asking them to take. And if that's a campaign that people are doing all over the country, well, before you know it, you've actually shifted the position of the parliament and maybe even the government. So I think there's a real you have more opportunity to be effective doing that here in Australia than we do in the United States.
My question is not unrelated to the one that Amin just asked, except I'm going to talk about the media. And since Stuart said that I was a radical, I'm going to start with a very radical Thank you for the young part too. But I'm going to start with a very radical comment, and then I'll ask a sensible question. And my radical comment is missing today, of course, from this symposium, were what we call the mainstream media representatives. So will we see the day, and this is the radical part, where Australians for Palestine will actually have someone from the Australian on their panel? And the sensible question is really to the organizers. Did you invite the Australian, the Age representatives from mainstream media? Have you heard back from any of them? You know, for the amount of coverage that Israel-Palestine gets, you'd think they would be interested in something like this.
So we did invite members from all of the media outlets. We sent out a press release advising of the event, and we did send specific emails to those foreign editors and email addresses that we knew personally. And the range of excuses came back from not in Melbourne at the time, can't afford the time, not my remit, I'll forward it on. So we sent to ABC, Channel 7, Channel 9, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a willful denial of opportunity for knowledge, I would have thought.
No, I'm sure that reporters from the Australian will not appear at Australians for Palestine panels in future. They might if the letterhead says AFP and they can get away with selling people as the Australian Federal Police or Agence France Presse or even the Armed Forces of the Philippines. You could do that, but no, they wouldn't see that as their job. I mean, in a sense, they're right not to see that as their job. The same kind of principle even applies to us in academia. You know that, for example, I've received numerous invitations over the years to speak in favor of a so-called one-state solution or a two-state solution in the Israel-Palestine conflict. I used to receive invitations to join lists calling for the establishment of an independent state for the Tamils of Sri Lanka, for example. And as I always say to people, you know, you don't want me to do that. What you want is for me to give my assessment as a scholar of peace and conflict studies as to what would need to be addressed in order to satisfactorily realize the rights of people involved in the conflict in order to move it into a less violent phase. And if my assessment is coming from somebody who has already signed up to a particular outcome, it's automatically devalued. So those kind of separations have to be maintained, I think. And what we need from journalists in mainstream media is to keep up that scrutiny on the institutions of Australian life and Australia's complicity. So as Paul said, the call for boycott, divestment and sanctions is actually only a call to stop being complicit with the occupation. It's not a call to do something, it's a call to refrain from doing something. And we need that to continue to be exposed by journalists and to be accepted as the sort of socially constructed fact that we can use as the basis for debate. In the same way, you know, we need journalists to discriminate between the expert opinion of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, on anthropogenic global warming on the one hand, and the oil industry funded think tanks on the other hand that are trying to get us to regard that as only one side of the story. You know, I mean, that's what we need journalists to do. We don't necessarily need journalists to become advocates.